Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. My name is Jelena Trkulja, and on behalf of Qatar Museums and Qatar Creates, I would like to welcome you to the third day of the Qatar Creates public talks. The talk we have today is created in collaboration with the Democracy and Culture Foundation, which is organizing Art for Tomorrow talks. And I would like to call the president of the foundation, Achilles Tsaltas, to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelena. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Doha and welcome to Art for Tomorrow in collaboration with Qatar Creates. It always feels a bit like a homecoming for us at Art for Tomorrow because this is where the conference started, along with Sheikh Mayasa and Qatar Museums back in 2015. We worked very closely with Jelena in putting the program together. And at the time, it was founded at the New York Times, along with another conference called the Athens Democracy Forum, which we also run every year in Athens. But what happened, just to explain to you a little bit about the foundation, what happened just a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, at the Times we decided that when it comes to culture and democracy, it's not a commercial enterprise, so we took the two conferences out of the commercial structure of the Times, and we created the Democracy and Culture Foundation to basically look at the nexus of culture and democracy, how each can help the other survive in these tumultuous times that our world is living in. So Art for Tomorrow conference, as I said, started here, was in Doha for 3 years. We went to Berlin for another 3. We're now in Italy. We were in Florence last year, and this year in June, we're in Venice, June 5 to 7. So we hope that you can make it there. That's the conference part. But as a brand extension of the conference, we do these Art for Tomorrow talks in Doha. We'll probably be in Berlin during Gallery Weekend, in Seoul during Freeze. So please follow us. And I know many of you have come to some of the conferences, but it will be great to see you in Venice. But without further ado, I'd like to call on our Editorial Director, Kim Conniff Taber, and her distinguished panel to start the talks this morning. And we hope to see you in Venice as well. Kim.
Lovely to see you all this morning. I'm the Editorial Director of Art for Tomorrow, and I'm very pleased to be here today with two distinguished panelists. I'm joined by Michael Govan. He's the director of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, as most of you know, and he curated the exhibition about Donald Judd and Dan Flavin, along with Jennifer King, here in Doha. And Flavin Judd, we're very lucky to have with us. He is the son of Donald Judd, and he is also the artistic director of the Judd Foundation, which is based in New York and Marfa, Texas. Although I just learned that he lives in Paris. So hopefully I'll get to see him there. So this morning I thought we would start with the exhibition itself. Hopefully you've all seen it by now. If you haven't, you only have 2 more days. So rush out there. It's on until Sunday. It's a fantastic show. It has 34 works by Dan Flavin, 25 by Donald Judd. And I just wanted to do a little intro first before we launch into the discussion. I don't want to take too much time with this, but I'd read a lot about the exhibition, of course. I'd seen all the photos online, but I finally went to visit it yesterday because I just arrived yesterday morning. And what really strikes you as you walk into the show is that the term minimalist could ever be applied to these two artists. And as Michael himself has said, they're anything but minimalist. When you walk in, you're confronted by color, light, reflection, shape, scale. The works catch the light, they throw it back at you. And even the empty spaces, to me, seem to just fill the room. So, Donald Judd himself, he called minimalism a lazy term. I think that you wrote that in one of your essays. And so I just want to start with 2 quotes from the artist, and then we'll launch into the discussion. So Donald Judd said, originally I thought, this is in a 1984 note, originally I thought that the art critics were so obviously glib and wrong that no one would take them seriously. But when I hear the same nonsense about minimalism and impersonality for 20 years, I realized that the cliches have stuck. And then Flavin, for his part, he also railed against labels. He didn't want to be... Dan Flavin, sorry, not this Flavin. We're going to have to distinguish each time. He didn't want to be put into a corner, even though he ended up using lots of corners in his works. And in a very now famous 1964 radio interview, he said, I don't look upon my work as a distinct reaction to abstract expressionism. I look at it as a proposal which digs into ground which stood long before the turgid painting reiterated itself. So I wanted to start with that and ask the 2 of you, was that one of the motivating factors for putting this exhibition together, to counter this perception about what minimalism is and also these artists' part in it? Put the intensity of color, space, materials on display? Michael.
I guess, in part. The show came out of a long relationship between LACMA and Cutter Museums. It's more than a decade of exhibition exchange and thinking, and so we're always talking. And as the idea came up, in part because there are works of art by both artists that are here, have been collected, and some are planned for the new museum at the Flour Mills, which will be the Modern and Contemporary Museum that's been much publicized here. And so it was that idea that the work is so often misunderstood, misread, and not seen of these 2 artists, partly because the typical thing is museums like to collect like Noah's Ark, one of these and one of that. And you put them in a room with, one fluorescent light piece, or we were just saying, a copper box or something that doesn't have the context and is very hard to read. So yes, this situation, the Al Riwak building on one floor, very modest building too, both artists railed against, among the many things they like to complain about. They had a lot of complaints. Judd always called them complaints, right? Very specifically. It's a book full of complaints. But one of the things they complained about was overwhelming architecture that did not do the art very much good. And so this building, this space, the sensitivity that Cutter Museums has, and also looking at it in a new context was to, yes, explode that myth that this is minimalism. Flavin also, there was a famous letter written by a woman to his show in Chicago, Pink and Gold, that's in the exhibition, the very large room of pink and gold. And she said, well, it was good, but it would have been better if it was all in white because it would have been more minimal. And Flavin wrote one of his famously sharp letters back. And he said it would better be called maximalism because of the power of the effect, even given. So we could go on and on about that. But yes, it seemed a unique opportunity. And I can say, certainly in my lifetime and working with the artists, there are very few cases where you've been able to see 2 artists like this in such an expansive presentation where hopefully in some way you don't need a lot of didactics because the work really does speak for itself. And that was the hope, that it would communicate directly as it was intended with its power of taking up space. So yes, it was this unique situation, and from the beginning the idea was to counter the minimalism thing and instead deal with other topics like relationship between art and architecture, serial production counting systems, and theme and variation, things that you would find in music. Color. Color's a huge thing, and that was sort of one thing that I really wanted to make it clear, color, and then of course the use of space. So I think the answer is...
how those things play off of each other.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of nice to have, there is a personal aspect of it, and Flavin can talk about that too, of this kind of friendship, and he can best talk about it given his name, Flavin Judd. Well, that's why we called the show Donald Judd, Dan Flavin, because of course Flavin Judd is a person. And the other kind of cool thing I just want to say about it, because you do two artists and the idea was this sense of balance, is very immediately, because here you read from right to left, and in the US we read from left to right, and the space is symmetrical, and so there was this very playfulness, even in how we did the titling and all that, is that you can go left, you can go right, you can go either way, you can circle this way, you can look at the spaces.
You can go through the middle.
Yeah, so I wanted just to say, I'm just so grateful to Cutter Museums in this place for having a chance to put forward ideas with these artists that really haven't been put forward in the same way in a dialogue anywhere, I think, in the world.
And if I understand correctly, they have exhibited together before, but not at all in this kind of expansive, monumental kind of capacity.
Yeah, and I mean, Flavin, you can talk about that too, because I think one of the first calls was to you when I was thinking about this idea, was to talk it through, and yeah.
So tell us about the call and how it all came to fruition.
I don't remember. It's a long time ago, but obviously I was an immediate supporter of the idea because, as Michael said, if you have one piece of either artist lost in a general conventional museum, you're not going to understand either the art or the artist or what they're trying to do, and the effect won't work because in both cases, the art is about the immediate reality of where you are and your relationship to the art. So it's almost necessary that you have a number of pieces to work with and a number of pieces to experience. And obviously, I'm a big supporter of both artists, so it makes sense to put them together. And this is what we have at Spring Street, and it looks great, so I knew it would look great.
I love the idea that you can walk right up to the works, too. Although there is a line. I crossed it yesterday and they complained to me, the security guards, but that you can, the idea is very much that you're present with the works in a way that it was intended, from what I gather. And you walk, as you say, you walk around them, you kind of area yourself in a dialogue with the works.
Yeah, basically the works are about you and space and light. So they're a way of experiencing that even more than normal.
There's an aspect of it too, in that sense of space, and Flavin, I was slightly, since it hadn't been done on this scale, I want to say this right, terrified of what Flavin would think, because only in the sense that having worked with these artists before and done several shows, especially of Dan Flavin and less of Donald Judd, that it's harder than it looks. That there is a sense of energy. So it isn't just the idea of just putting them in space, but Judd was especially a master at this idea of, it's like a Japanese rock garden or something. If two objects are too close, they crowd each other. If they're too far away, there's no energy, and there's some place where they resonate.
They're like magnets. If they're too close, it explodes. They're too far apart, there's no relationship. It's very difficult, yeah.
And it's hard to do, because you can't really do it with models or anything. It does take a little of that experience. And we talked a lot about that when we, even the Dan Flavins are like that in a different way, because because light fills space literally, right? Like literally the light goes a certain distance, and each color in a Dan Flavin projects differently, spatially, as well as optically. And so it takes a really long time to figure out and to predict, and in this case, working with the studio and Steve Morris and others there who I've known and worked with for many, many years, decades, we'll say. But it's a really interesting thing, these artists whose work also depends on how it's shown. And they spoke about that very clearly. And it's like you almost want to give a warning label to trying that. It just takes a long, people look at it and say, oh, well, we can just put that there or this here. And then, as you know, you'll walk into houses or museums, as they walked into museums and just complained bitterly that there was no understanding of that. But so the bar is higher, but of course it has amazing results. As if you go to Marfa, Texas, where Don Judd invited Dan Flavin to participate in his project, which was not only to show his own works, but works of other artists in a the anti-museum museum, because it's works of art by artists, but but of course he worked with them specifically on how to place them individually and together and in space in a way that you can't really see anywhere else.
And also, and I imagine that was some of the appeal of coming here, because there is the space as there is in Marfa, to be able to show almost, I mean, and I learned this yesterday, that even the structures on the wall, where there's, I think, 30-something or 30 of them here, that's actually supposed to be something like 60?
Yeah, New York's too small. That's the problem, for instance.
New York's too small, but even, yeah, so Marfa or here is the only place.
Do you have pictures? You were going to rotate.
Yeah, we're going to put the pictures on in just 1 second. I just want to talk a tiny bit, and then we'll get to the art, about the friendship itself. So they met in '62 in Brooklyn. It was a gathering to discuss the possibility of maybe mounting an artist-led gallery. And then they exhibited together for the first time about a year or so later.
Something like that, yeah.
At the Green Gallery in New York, and then they became lifelong friends. Obviously, you're named after Judd Flavin. Can you regale us with a few
going
memories?
Going to birthday parties and Stephen. So Stephen Flavin, Dan's son. There is a yet unpublished interview where we actually all got together, and they were reminiscing in the Judd in the space on Spring Street about just being there for birthday parties as you guys were growing up, right?
Yeah, I mean, they were good friends, and Dan and Stephen and Sonia, Stephen's mother, were some of the people I saw a lot. But before we moved to Texas full-time in '76, we were in New York a lot, and so there was a lot of, for Don, there were a lot of people around. But they were very different people. Dan liked a lot of food, a lot of people, a lot of tricks. He was a very clever kind of, what's the word? I can't remember, when you're playing tricks on people. And Don didn't like socializing. So
yeah.
They were very close, but very different at the same time. So it was interesting. But they're both wicked smart, and they're very clear on what they want to do. And their art both, in a way, comes out of creating their own culture because they're not happy with the culture that they're in. And culture can be nationwide, village, or individual, and they're both clearly doing their own individual thing. And people put them together, actually, as minimalists, but they came from pretty different origins, and their practice is different. Don would have never thought of using light itself. He was very much interested in objects. So it's a very different thing. So
you think the light, in a way, is emblematic of his personality? He was
is his interest. I mean, they both started out as painters. I mean, that's one thing to remember, is that they both started out completely conventional painters. And in Don's case, I can't speak for Dan, in Don's case, he was unhappy with trying to make painting do what he wanted to do. And for him, it was a slow realization that you could paint a tree, or you could have an actual tree. And for him, the tree was a lot more interesting than the painting of the tree. And so he's trying to make something that's as interesting as a tree. So it's very much a here and now thing. Dan's not doing that, but he is in a certain way. So there's lots of different layers.
Would you say that evolution happened at around the same time for both of them, or did one influence the other because they had this strong relationship?
The New York in the early 60s, mid-60s, was a complete soup of incredibly creative people that we haven't seen since in New York, that's for sure. And I asked my mother once, who are our neighbors? Because I remember a lot of people, and the list she had of our neighbors who came by is like a who's who of late 20th century artists. Dancers, artists, musicians, writers, everything. So it was a really, really creative time. And so who's to say how the influences came about? Because I don't think even the artists could say that.
Or just being there in New York at that time.
Yeah, I think that's this truth that we know about the soup, as you call it, of creative work when creative people are together in the same space. And so obviously, without showing everything, just this like sneak peek into two artists. A lot of the show is about how they're different, how their practices were very different. They were very different personalities, as you said. I think prankster was the word you were looking for Dan Flavin, and he was like that till the end. Don was the more, I would say serious, although he had a light side for sure.
He couldn't pull a prank for his life.
No, he couldn't.
So.
And Dan was always telling jokes, and so there's these two different personalities. Also, Dan Flavin was really self-taught. He did take a couple of art classes, whereas Judd was one of the most erudite, thoughtful, powerful writers, and he had a lot of commentary on other work. He wouldn't just tell jokes about it, as Dan would. So they're very different, but there is something about this idea of invention. As Flavin's saying, that time was a time where invention. I've heard people tell stories about running to the one gallery in New York, the famous Green Gallery. We actually reproduced a bit of the Dan Flavin's show from the Green Gallery because it included a work dedicated to Don Judd. But where people would just rush to the gallery to see what was happening next because it was going to be something you'd never seen before. That was like the guarantee. It would be some huge innovation. And so this notion of innovation too, that I think both artists were interested, that innovation and then lasting power at the same time. I loved, it always stuck with me, the New York show when it was Brock Picasso, because, giant figures, but they were sitting talking at one point about little cubes. And that became cubism in a way. And so I think this idea of, there's conversation around invention. None of us are singular. And yet the practices really did diverge. I came late to the scene, opposite of Flavin, where they were quite separate by the time I met them both. They shared their complaints about museums. And I would say me at the time, because I was working at the Guggenheim Museum. So I actually met them under duress. And
what were they complaining about?
I was about museums. About museums
general,
not
about
caring
something...
for their work, not presenting it properly. They weren't getting paid.
It's a long list.
Yeah, it's a long list. It would take an hour. But
did you take them into account?
Well, I got to meet both of them under duress. I mean, one of the greatest days of my entire life, literally of my life education, was when Klaus Oldenburg, another artist, and Kosha Van Bruggen said to Don Judd, apparently, you should let him come to Marfa because he's too young to have done anything too wrong yet. And so I went there, and he took me for an entire day through pretty much everything he was doing, and it was one of the singularly most important aspects of my personal and artistic education. And in a way, he challenged me to do better at museums. So I personally credit him for the challenge he laid down. Similarly, Flavin had the same complaints. And at the time, they were complaining a little about each other, too, as that happens in a certain time in your life, I guess, as you have two giant figures with their own careers. And I was getting tips from either of them. They obviously both wanted to reconnect, but sadly, they didn't live really long enough to do it deeply. But that was embodied in the reconnection was embodied in the installation in Marfa, Texas, as part of the Chinati Foundation, where Flavin did finally, decades later, accept the invitation to have his work there.
I didn't realize a lot of time had elapsed between the invitation and when the works were actually.
So there was this coming together, and that was what I was lucky to be part of. They were sort of coming together, and there is a moment in the rooms where, there are a lot of, I would say, inside, as Dan and Don like to do, inside, not jokes, but playful things about the installation. And one of them is the center room, the giant circle, where there's a piece to Don Judd, colorist, by Dan Flavin. His work in color, pointing out that Don Judd was one of the greatest colorists of art history, and Dan really felt that, and he tried to live up to that in his own color. And it's sort of that light fills the room with this beautiful aluminum late work that Don Judd did
It's
that
an
includes
homage.
curves and straight pieces and squares. And if you look, the light sort of gently goes through them and projects on the wall where they are intermingling in a way. And it was a fun idea to try to bring their work back together. It's not easy because they really did diverge in what they were doing, but there's a core something together that keeps them together. There's a conversation.
The two of them. There's that dialogue, I think, in the show too. Before I want you to just hold that thought for 2 seconds. Can we put the works on a loop now? We do. I don't think we have the specific work that you were talking about just now from Marfa, but we do have a few of the works from Marfa, and then also mostly from the show.
I just wanted to say that one of the connections relative to what you're saying is that this piece right here, which is Dan Flavin at Chinati, there's not one right angle in the entire piece. So that's Dan Flavin saying, I can do this without a right angle. So
It's a very direct, kind of a prank.
right, totally.
We'll just have these going because I think it'll inform and illustrate the next section, which we've already actually been talking about, but the art itself, what was so revolutionary about their work. It sits somewhere between painting and sculpture, more towards sculpture, but it's the intensity of painting is present in the works. So what we really want to make sure we get to is their influence that their work and that their life's work had on architecture, on design, on other artists. So maybe if Flavin, you want to talk a little bit about that?
I think there are people
Michael?
in the audience.
Not my area.
And we will have,
Talk about
start thinking about
Annabelle.
questions because we will in about, let me look at the time here. Yeah, in about 5 minutes or so, we'll open it up to questions.
Maybe it's there. I would say that their influence is so pervasive that it's even hard to pinpoint sometimes. I mean, we can give many examples, or I could, of retail stores which are direct knockoffs, where people have tried to copy because there's something so both essential and sensuous at the same time about this work. And I think so many designers have looked at that as inspiration for their own work, and some have obviously copied it. I mean, I can think of the Calvin Klein store in New York, where one year he was literally just trying to copy all of Judd's plywood furniture as the interior of the store. And then actually, I worked with Dan Flavin. He actually then finally commissioned Dan, because it was like, if you're going to copy these artists, they're, in this case, Flavin's still alive, why don't you just commission him? And so he did. And so off of Madison Avenue was these beautiful red lights in the store. But I think the influence is pervasive. But the question is why? Why is it so pervasive? Why do so many artists, even artists who I would argue are so not minimalist? I can think of an artist like a friend of mine, Jorge Pardo, who works with, you would never look at that work and say, oh, that's like Flavin and Judd, but he would tell you about the relationship, or a video artist who will tell you about the relationship of how light influenced their thinking about video and space by Don Judd. So the question is, why is it so powerful? And I think it is that combination for me of the essential clarity, the directness, and this idea that direct and clear is also sensuous somehow and beautifully attractive, even if a lot of, I mean, think about it, Judd using galvanized metal, which is just gray and metal and is meant to be not used for itself, but always underneath something or for an inexpensive use. And of course, he turned it into one of the most luxurious materials in a way that I can think of that use. So many, even plywood, which was not, I mean, there's Schindler and a few other examples.
Reject materials.
Reject materials that were to be covered by other materials, right? So there's a metaphor in that. Fluorescent light is the thing you don't look at the light, look at the light it's giving, but you don't look at the bulb itself. It's above you in the grocery store. And so this idea of also changing your perception to look at the thing itself is so powerful.
I think one of the things of both artists is they're extremely radical. If you look at what was being done 5 or 10 years before them, it has nothing to do with what they were doing. And also, besides being radical, in Don's case, as I said, he's a painter for 15 years. He worked diligently at it, and he couldn't make it do what he wanted. So he basically, over time, decided he had to get rid of art history, he had to get rid of philosophy, he had to get rid of all theory, basically, and just deal with what he knew. So his art is about what you actually know and can confirm. It's about physics, it's about reality, it's about the so-called banality of life. This stuff, what is it? What does it feel like? What does it look like? And all of this stuff is very temporal. It disappears like that. And Don is basically saying, this is what is important. What is here? Our lives are short.
Like the present time, living in the moment.
And I think that reverberates for other artists because it's foundational.
But at the same time, I think all of those things that he did before and studied before, it's infused in the work. As you say, there's a sensuousness to it. The material itself speaks to something. It's not as if he just kind of rejected, at least that's what I feel when I'm in the room.
You reject and you build from scratch. So it's not like, Don, I mean, we joked, you see Piero della Francesca, and he's not going to say, oh, it's a Piero della Francesca from the 16th century, I'm not interested. On the contrary, it's a great painting, but maybe I could borrow it for a couple of months and I'll learn something from it. So it's a rejection to then go to the next level, basically. And that's why the work is radical.
Away. I mean, what you were saying just now, it just makes me think of great writing, right? That it's, you can have all this kind of purple prose, but sometimes the most effective writing is when you kind of strip everything else away and just get to the point.
There's something, they both loved art. Like references for their work could be Piero della Francesca, or I think being here where we are, Dan Flavin and Don had this passion for ceramics, Asian ceramics from the Middle East, from Europe, and things that are just very sensuous and beautiful. And so there's lots of references, but there is this question of like going to ground zero and starting again from scratch about essential things, color, form, space, which is so powerful. And I think has never been done. It had never been done in that way so directly, in a philosophical way, to question the nature of form and structure.
It's kind of like cooking. Like if you want to cook something really good, you don't use all the ingredients at once. You figure out what you're going to do. And so both Dan and Don, which are two of the most sensuous 250-pound men you'll ever meet, figured out which ingredients to take to then make a stronger result, instead of dumping every known ingredient into a pot and seeing what happens. It's not going to work. So you have to be able to reject 99% of what's available to come up with something that's new.
Relevant for our times, I would say.
Yeah, although it is worth saying that the most risky room in the show, and there was a little picture of one, was, and we talked about this, so I kind of had permission from the master of design architecture, Flavin, was those late works, the Swiss pieces, they're so-called. They're untitled, the Donald Judd pieces, which seem to be in random color organization. And you think, it almost seems irrational, but this he's playing with that, the idea of randomness and irrational. And Flavin is making at the same time these works dedicated to a British potter. Her name was Lucy Ree, who he loved, and they stick out from the wall, and they're made with maybe a few too many ingredients also. But it just shows the range. And so I thought at the end we just throw the two of them together to show the range of expression, because that's the other thing. You see a picture in a book or in one museum, and you see a work, and you identify that with the expression of the artist. The whole idea of this show is you can see a whole range of expression, from quiet to kind of loud to meditative to questioning, and I think that's the other exciting thing. It's not one tone, but it's lots of tones, and that's hard to see unless you have this amount of space.
Those works been shown together before then?
No one would be stupid enough to do that.
That's because they like reflect off of each. That's what's so interesting. They look like they were intended to.
This is on the list of museum complaints. It's in the book. There's 1,000 pages.
Yes, I know. I read not all of them, but many of them.
But obviously it's playful because they
Yes.
do work together, and there's I could show you as many similarities in structure and seeming randomness that isn't, and also again, but I think the main purpose of that room was to show the love of color and the power of color. That color really can go many places.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I think we have somebody who can go around. You think of one?
I'm going to assign questions if you all don't figure some out. Come on.
So the quote, which is about influence and impact, and then I have kind of two final questions, and then we'll need to wrap it up. But so this is from Donald Judd, in a 1987 essay, one of his art and architecture essays. He said, "For myself and others in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, art had to be defined as art itself, only itself, in order to be developed. The social systems and their wars had demolished the earlier efforts towards more general thinking. I have no trouble in maintaining my original alienation, but I think given the choice, we would prefer that our work have some effect upon others." So I thought it was really interesting because I think in his earlier work, or at least earlier in his artistic career, he didn't care so much about whether, or at least maybe not.
It wasn't an option. These are people who all had day jobs, never expected to make a living as artists, never, maybe, they would see their work in galleries, but probably never thought they would be in museums. I mean, it was a different time, and there was no career as an artist. Jackson Pollock had a flaming career and then died. So that was the model. So I think to them, in the very small situation in New York, it was very divorced from the larger society because it just was. And, the people I met as a child coming to Spring Street were not your normal New Yorkers walking around the street. They were actually a very small group of radical people. I mean, Philip Glass was our plumber. So, it's a very different situation than the rest of the country.
When did you realize that? Is that something you grew up knowing, or did you?
No, when
you
you're
were just in your bubble and
when you're growing up, you think it's all normal. And I was explaining to somebody else that I had friends who lived on the Upper East Side of New York who lived in little apartments, and I felt really sorry for them because they lived in these tiny apartments, but they were billionaires or something. But I couldn't understand what they were doing in these little apartments. So the values I grew up with were almost antagonistic to American capitalism. And quite frankly, I think my parents were right, and the American capitalists were not so right. But it was a very small community in basically a wasteland of Manhattan, which is hard to explain. That at that time, Lower Manhattan was a bunch of empty factories, and we were, 50 people living down there. So it was very different. So that's what, there was a lot of change between, 1960 and 1990 or something.
So I was going to ask, do you think that kind of, the equivalent kind of upbringing is possible today?
Sure, but I don't know where, but I'm sure somebody's doing it somewhere, yeah.
Yeah, there's something in that quotation too. I'm not sure I understood it totally, but people look at these works and they're very abstract, geometric, but it's not like there's not a specific politics in them, although, the artist did write and talk occasionally, but there's a lot of questioning, and there is this investigation of society in it, if you can get into it deeply. This idea of peeling away layers, giving you some essence, and I would say embedded in this work are a lot of questions. As much as there are, they look like answers, but there's a lot of questions about society, who we are, how we live, what we live with. And I think that's a whole line of investigation that is as relevant today as when they were in the tumultuous 60s, when that was the thing. Everyone was questioning everything, the systems of institutions. I mean, the complaints, if you will, about museums is part of the broader complaints about, institutions and the individual versus the institution, which is a whole topic of discussion that we could have about their work and others. So I guess it's interesting to me that it also speaks, it's not, yes, they're Americans, but these are general questions about society too that they're asking, and about space, and just even asking questions is important, and I think as relevant today anywhere as when they made it in those tumultuous times and started thinking about this. Again, they were really tumultuous times of the 60s, and it's also interesting, and this is true about their lives a little bit, maybe, I don't know if you would say this, but they were both obsessive collectors. They had tons of everything. The amount of stuff they had filled warehouses. I mean, Judd could not get enough warehouses for his furniture collection.
He bought
everything.
houses for his collections of pots.
Stuff.
So,
and when you went into Dan Flavin's house, it was so the opposite of minimal. He loved and collected stuff: wood, glass, prints, belt buckles they loved, Navajo rugs. They collected so much because they had this appreciation for craft and all of that. And you think about the swirling energy of the 60s and what's going on, and even questions about in the United States about the Vietnam War and all that, and them just making this clear art that asks those questions and gives us space.
The room's full
for
of
our
stuff,
own thinking.
then the work.
You clear it out
clear it
for
out.
like a ground zero to start thinking again. With all that in the background, they're not saying no to art history or trying to wipe it out. It's actually all there.
on the contrary,
It's the opposite. And they're just clearing space to ask a lot of questions about everything. Or at least that's the way I've kind of encountered the work and feel strongly about it.
It's interesting what you said earlier about politics and how the work isn't necessarily about politics, but do you think some of the work is political? I'm thinking about one piece in particular that even has a title. It's one of Flavin's pieces about the soldiers in the...
Yeah,
fallen
soldiers killed in
the-
ambush, his brother. That's a specific dedication, and it has to do with the Vietnam War. So
Looks
they
like
were,
a crossbow, kind of. I don't know if I'm assuming
is.
that's intentional, but...
and they were for peace. I mean, at that time, I would say, if there was a consistency to that moment. But it's not. Again, it's not political in the sense of taking sides in a debate. It's again, in their politics, there's no way to even translate it. It's so unique, but it is questioning.
but I think, for instance, that their opposition to the Vietnam War was fit in with their opposition to all of the institutions, because the institutions were not doing anything to improve anything. I mean, New York City was going bankrupt at the time, so you couldn't rely on these institutions to even make sure that people had enough to eat. And meanwhile, they're invading other countries pointlessly. So this dissatisfaction with the almost entirety of society, between Vietnam and bankruptcy of New York and plastic chairs that you can only buy in Marfa and can't get real chairs, it's multi-leveled. And that basically, the art and, for instance, Don's installations are an antidote to all of that.
Yeah, that's the key
Like,
thing.
I
So
love
you
that,
have an
an
environment
antidote.
of protest, and then it's easy to have complaints. Everyone has complaints, but to then make something, to create a space for thinking about the future. And like politics for Judd and Flavin too, where, for example, we don't always have to build new things. Judd was very specific and very clear in his writing, but Flavin himself took over was a fire station and a Baptist church, and reused an old piece of architecture as a way of recycling, as Don Judd wrote very poignantly about that idea, about how many old buildings there are, in this case in the United States, and why don't we just reinvest them, because they have history and memory, and why do we throw everything away and, build new architecture?
While their ethics and politics are not visible in their art, it's completely tied together. And the clarity of the art is tied to a clarity in ethics and a responsibility to things. And it's all one thing, because it all comes from the same source.
Not overtly
In that sense, the
political, but
art
the
is
politics
not, the art is
in-
not a
in
visual
art.
representation of the politics, in the same way that they're not a visual representation of a tree.
Yeah. Like, for example, part of the politics is pay attention, look closely, understand the space you're in, and slow down and think about it. And that's a point of view about life that's maybe not so popular now, but
Well,
in little quarters it is. But this work brings it back.
yeah, exactly. Well, and people are trying to find that, aren't they? Trying to find a sense of calm, a sense of space, meditate, going back to the basics, I think is a movement.
It's in the desert, so.
In the
That's my
desert.
opinion.
Strip it away in the desert.
Dan, just another difference. Dan found it in the city. He liked it in the light.
Dan
of the
hated
city.
the desert.
He
so-
hated
the desert.
Did he spend much time there?
Oh my God, he went to Marfa and he was like, he was dying
Stayed
to
in
get
his
out
room
of there.
and watched baseball games on TV in the motel because he really didn't love the desert. But again, two very different personalities, but there's something common through this sense of paying attention, careful sense of color, space, light. That's a way of thinking that they shared.
So, and you may have just said it, but because we do have to wrap up in a moment, if there's one thing that you would hope that the viewer would take away, the spectator, from this show, what would it be?
I hope there's lots of things, but the show hopefully has a lot of room for people to think about, their own thoughts. And I guess it would be that thing of pay attention, look closely, feel things, slow down. It's the environment you're in, the space you're in, the feeling of all of that. Look carefully even at color and how it's different and how it affects you differently and how a line that's horizontal is different from one that's vertical and how space and material and space interact. Things that we go through the world and we're not even looking at most of the time.
At Judd Foundation in Marfa, we have Don's library and it has 13,000 books. And so the combination of pay attention and the other thing I would say is explore more. That the world is big, history is long, and you occupy a very small part of it. And if you just spent your entire life exploring more and more and more and more, it would be a very good use of that time.
Yeah, and it's a weird, also the last thing is about, there's a whole range of emotions from, there's a bit of optimism in it, but there's also some sadness too. There's a lot of emotion in it, and I think that you have to just spend time with it to pull apart. But
So pay attention, explore more, sit with your emotions.
Go to
maybe.
the desert.
And go to the desert.
We are in the desert.
And we are in the desert, so
That was the other.
thank you so much. Well,
Thank you.
we'll wrap it up with that. That's a perfect ending. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your time.